Hi students, this is Dr. Taylor and I'm just going to walk you through some editing methods today. This is coming from the Paramedic Method by Richard Langham, who wrote the book Revising Prose. And he created this method for a couple of different reasons, but he really wanted to help students and writers develop a strong, clear style. It's particularly useful for addressing awkward or confusing sentences, especially if you're not sure what's making the sentence awkward or confusing. So if someone writes a comment on your paper that says awkward or I'm not quite sure what you're trying to say, this is a kind of heuristic or method you can use to help you work on clarifying it. It really focuses on prepositional phrases, verbs, and what we call general lard, or the kind of excess set of words that end up in sentences when you're just kind of thinking out loud or the equivalent on the page. It's a particularly useful approach to have when you need to be very clear and very concise. So, for business, professional, and academic writing. All right, so the first step when you're using the paramedic method is to identify prepositions. Hopefully you guys know what prepositions are, but just to clarify, they're words that indicate relationships between nouns and pronouns. So at, in, on, of, to, from, into, about, around, below, above, near, since, through, against, after, and there are a couple others that will probably come up, but this is just to kind of give you a sense of the different words that you're going to be looking for. So I'm going to use a sentence that actually came from a student paper. It's not any of your papers. This is one from last semester, but it has all of these kind of words in it. So if you look at this particular sentence, it says, an evaluation of Alexander's rhetoric shows that her book was written about the unjust mass incarceration of African Americans for an audience that was already predisposed to agree with her final conclusion. Now, this sentence isn't horrible. That's not why I'm using it. I'm using it because it has all the things that Lanham says you can kind of work on. So the prepositions in this sentence are of, um, about, for, to, and with. I think with got left off the original list, but it is also a preposition. So all of these are words that you're going to want to make sure that you identify in your sentences before you're getting around to actually rewriting them. The second thing you want to do is identify to be verbs. Okay, to be verbs, very straightforward. Any version of the word is or to be, so are, was, will be, all of those kind of count. And the real reason you want to do this is because to be forms, especially when they're combined with other verbs, actually weaken the strength of a sentence. So saying he was inspiring to the students is a lot weaker than he inspired the students. Even though they mean pretty much the same thing, unless there's a real reason where you want to emphasize the pastness of it, it's stronger to say he inspired the students. So if we look at the verbs in that same sentence we were looking at before, you'll see that it is was written and were already predisposed. So we have two uses of to be verbs in this sentence. The third step is to identify other verbs. You're going to want to look especially for verbs that have been kind of accidentally turned into nouns. Those are called nominalizations. So in this original sentence, you'll see that I put them all in blue. So an evaluation is a nominalization of the verb to evaluate. So an evaluation of Alexander's rhetoric shows that her book was written about the unjust mass incarceration of African Americans for audiences that were already predisposed to agree with her final conclusions. So we have a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 verbs in this sentence. The next thing you want to do is check those verbs for passive voice. If you guys have taken another language, you may know what the passive voice is, but it's really about the order in which we construct things in the English language that's important. So active voice is when the subject, that is the person who is going to be doing the action in the sentence, comes before the action or the verb, and then the object or whatever the verb is being done to, that comes at the end of the sentence. So subject, verb, object, or actor, action, thing the action affects. That's active voice. So an example, this would be Shakespeare wrote Hamlet in the 17th century. Shakespeare is the subject of the sentence. He is the actor, the one doing the action. The action, of course, is writing. He wrote. And then what he wrote is Hamlet. And then we have a prepositional phrase in the second half that kind of is explaining when that happened. So that's an example of active voice. Passive voice takes two different forms, but they're both very different from that original one. It's where it inverts the order so that the verb comes before the subject, and sometimes it has object, verb, subject, or it might just be object, verb. So an example of that with the same kind of sentence would be Hamlet was written in the 17th century. That would be passive voice, but the actor would be missing because it wouldn't include Shakespeare. But if you had Shakespeare in there, so Hamlet was written by Shakespeare in the 17th century, it still is grammatically correct, but it's a lot more wordy because it's in the passive voice, and it also puts the emphasis in different places. So you'll see passive voice is oftentimes used when people want to avoid giving responsibility to a particular person. So when you say mistakes were made, you're leaving out the person who's doing the action. You're leaving out the actor. You're using passive voice to avoid responsibility. That's not always a good thing. So looking for passive voice and then fixing it oftentimes allows you to give much stronger sentences and give appropriate responsibility or blame or whatever word you want to use to whoever's doing the action. Okay, so if you're not sure if a verb is in the passive voice, you can use the zombie rule. Put the word by zombie after the verb. If it makes grammatical sense, at least temporarily, it is passive voice. So Hamlet was written in the 17th century would have become Hamlet was written by zombies in the 17th century. Now, logically, that doesn't make sense, but grammatically, it does. So it tells you that it was passive voice. If you put Shakespeare wrote by zombies Hamlet, it wouldn't make any sense grammatically or logically. So you know that that would be active voice. So let's look at it with the sentence that we were looking at earlier. So what I've just done in this first chunk is put by zombies after each of those, 7 verbs. So an evaluation by zombies. Oh, actually, that is passive voice because it's nominalization in this case. Of Alexander's rhetoric shows by zombies. Does that one work? No. So that one's not going to be passive voice. And you can just do the same thing with all those different verbs. Okay, so what I've done here is another version where I've crossed it out when it's actually active voice. So 2 of the verbs are already in active voice. The rest are passive voice, or they may still want to be rewritten for clarity, but at least you know that grammatically it's more like passive voice. All right, so now we're actually getting to the point where you can start rewriting the actual sentences. And the easiest place and most important place to start is with the verbs. So the first thing you want to do is change passive to active voice wherever that's possible and rewrite or remove unnecessary to be verbs. And with all these, there's not going to be a case where you're going to always be able to fix every single last thing, but your goal is to see if you can. Okay, so before would be an evaluation of Alexander's rhetoric shows that her book was written about the unjust mass incarceration of African Americans for audiences that were already predisposed to agree with her final conclusion. If we take out and rewrite those passive voice into active voice, you would say, my evaluation of Alexander's rhetoric shows she wrote her book about the unjust systematic mass incarceration of African Americans for audiences already predisposed to agree with her final conclusion. So we've simplified and brought out who's doing the action. Melissa's really saying, oh, it's my evaluation. Instead of saying shows that her book was written, it says she wrote. So we've taken that passive voice and made it active. Mass incarceration we've kind of left because it's part of a noun phrase that can't easily be rewritten. So that one stays. And then predisposed, again, that one I don't think there's an easy way to do it. Predisposed doesn't have an actor the same way other verbs do. So it's okay to leave that one in the passive voice. Okay. Now, one thing you're going to want to ask yourself after you've changed those is which verb is actually most important to the main purpose of the sentence? And is there a way to create a stronger verb more central to the purpose of the sentence? Because right now we have evaluation, which really puts the emphasis on the author of the paper in a way that maybe is not what the sentence is supposed to be about. Shows is not actually a very strong verb. It's kind of a weak verb. Is it doing more than showing, or what's going on? We have the implicit idea of writing that's in here. There's just an awful lot of verbs, and I may want to think about how do I rewrite that sentence to make it clear what's really important in what I'm saying. Right? But I'm going to postpone that for a second and instead talk about reducing prepositional phrases, because I think this will help with figuring out what is actually the most important idea in the sentence. Okay, so prepositional phrases, remember we already marked out where all those different prepositions were. So the phrases are the whole set of words that come after a preposition. We're going to want to do the same thing as the last time, is remove, refine, or rewrite unnecessary prepositional phrases. And no, you probably won't be able to get rid of all of them, but you might change some of the verbs in the process to clarify the main purpose of the sentence. So before, my evaluation of Alexander's rhetoric shows she wrote her book about the unjust systematic mass incarceration of African Americans for audiences already predisposed to agree with her final conclusion. You can see how long some of those prepositional phrases are. So if I rewrite this sentence, here's how I might do it. Alexander's rhetoric addresses audiences already predisposed to agree that mass incarceration systematically and unjustly targets African Americans. You can see that what I've done here is a couple of things. First off, I said, well, what's really important about the sentence isn't my evaluation. What's really important about the sentence is Alexander's rhetoric. So let's make that the actor. I want something that's more aggressive than just it shows, because that's actually about what the evaluation was doing, not what the rhetoric was doing. And I want something that includes that element of writing that Alexander was doing. So Alexander's rhetoric addresses audiences, and I'm leaving already predisposed to agree, but I'm switching the order of the sentence so that instead of saying agree with her final conclusion, I'm saying, well, her final conclusion is actually that the unjust systematic mass incarceration of African Americans is really what her conclusion is about. So I'm saying that they're predisposed to agree that mass incarceration systematically and unjustly targets African Americans. So I have a stronger set of verbs, I have fewer prepositions. We just have this one prepositional phrase where before we had 3 or 4. Okay, so we've really kind of shrunk this sentence down and made it more precise with its verbs, with its prepositional phrases, and how all of it is put together. Okay, now the last step for the paramedic method after you've done all these things is just kind of a fun one. It's completely optional, and that's to calculate the lard factor. So what you do is you count the number of words in the original, you count the number of words in the new version, subtract the new version from the original, and then divide that number by the original. So our original sentence that we started with was 32 words. Okay, kind of a long sentence. The new version is just 17 words. So 17 from 32 is 15. 15 divided by 32 is 47%. So we cut this sentence by 47% by using the paramedic method. That's how much lard was in this project. So, to summarize the paramedic method, the first step is circle the prepositions, or if you want to just use a color, one color if you're doing it on a computer. You're going to want to put a box around the to be verbs, underline other verbs, and identify the most important one, or identify the need for a new verb. You're going to want to check each verb for passive voice, and then revise, focusing especially on creating stronger verbs and fewer prepositional phrases, and then optionally calculate the lard factor. On the next slide, you'll see 3 different sentences, all from actual student papers. These were from WP2 that would benefit from being rewritten by these rules. So choose 2, or you can do all 3 if you want, to practice revising these.